morning. Apparently not. This is the Lord's day. He made it. He said that He made the morning, and you're to rejoice. He said you shall. It's a commandment. It is not an option. Hello? It doesn't matter how cold it was this morning, what you think is cold. In 2 weeks, I'll be going to Russia on my 52nd trip to Russia. We're doing mission work over there. Believe me, you don't know anything about cold. Hello? I don't care where you're from, even International Falls. I don't care. You know nothing about cold. There's nothing like using an outhouse at minus 40. It'll get your attention in a lot of parts of your body, too. Hello? But I'm really glad to be back here. We want to express our thank you to the church for supporting us in our mission work and the relationship we've had over all these years, especially with your pastoral family, of course. They put me in the doghouse with the dogs when I'm here. Apparently you've never been to Pastor's house. I don't know. Well, the fact of the matter is, I'm lovely to be back here with you. And this morning we're going to be talking about creation evangelism. But I want to remind you, tonight we're going to be talking about the subject of the origin of the races. We're going to be talking about why there is no such thing as different human races. There's only one human race. Now, we do have different ethnic appearances, and there are good reasons for that, but there's only one human race. Tomorrow night, we're going to be talking about the actual evidence to prove that dinosaurs and people live together. That we have reliable history, art, and artifacts to prove that, in fact, people and dinosaurs really did live together, and until quite recently. Then, on Tuesday night, we're going to be talking about a somewhat related subject, which is, do sharp claws and sharp teeth a meat eater make? The fact of the matter is, evolutionists will teach you and your children that sharp claws, sharp teeth make a creature a meat eater. That is absolutely not true. As a matter of fact, 16 years ago, T-Rexes were reclassified as vegetarians. Hello? Oh, really? And I'll prove that to you on Tuesday night. The fact of the matter is, though, you're going to want to be here Tuesday night. It's actually a presentation I put together for children, but I find that adults like it as much or more. So you really want to be here and not use that coupon at the restaurant on Tuesday night. And we have saved our most explosive presentation for you on Wednesday night. We're going to be talking about Mount St. Helens. It's a volcano. It's our most explosive presentation. Hello. There's coffee out there for a reason. And some of you, I think, need 2 cups. And don't use that low test stuff. Use the high test stuff. Up there, see? Yes, just reminded him. He picked up his cup. But this morning I want to talk about creation evangelism. Now, I am a creation evangelist, but I want you to think with me. By the way, I love to have response. I love for you guys to, answer back and forth. Now, remember, Brother Lee is listening, okay? Hello? Would you agree that all Christians are called to share their faith in Christ with others? Yes. Well, that's better than the 3 we had the first service. I think that was about 6. Come on, folks, he's listening. All Christians are called to share their faith in Christ with others, correct? Yes. Much better. But I want you to think about this. Sharing your faith in Christ with others is a perfectly valid way of winning others to Christ. I don't want you to misunderstand me at all. But it doesn't work with everybody. Hello? And so if you're going to share your faith in Christ, you have to have different tools that you can pull this one out here and this one out there kind of thing. And so this morning I want to introduce you to creation evangelism. It is not to replace sharing faith. It's just an alternative in the right situation. Because the world is asking good questions. And when you try to share your faith in Christ, and somebody says, well, wait a minute, what about the dinosaurs? What about those millions and billions of years for which there is no proof? What about the supposed proof for human evolution and so forth? What about that stuff? And if you don't know the good answers to good questions, they've got no reason to pay any attention to you at all. And so this is why the resource table is there. You've got to feed yourself. I'm just an ammunition bearer, folks. I bring the ammunition, but you're the ones that have to use it. And so you need to arm yourself with a way of defending Christ in more than just sharing your faith. And that's what we want to talk about this morning. Now, again, I used to be an evolutionist. Really mentioned that to you. But I was more than just an evolutionist. You see, I was raised on the campus of the University of California, Berkeley. Anybody ever heard of that place? Yeah. Now, Berkeley, that is the capital of evolution today. Hello? I mean, you can also mention Harvard in here too, but Berkeley is actually the one that is the biggest one. And I grew up in the capital of liberalism the city border getting out if you're not already an evolutionist in Berkeley. And, hello? But that's why I was an evolutionist. I earned my science degrees as an evolutionist. I taught it from the 7th grade to the university level. But at the age of 27, in a search for truth, I became a Christian. At the age of 28, I became a creationist. And so today I've been going around the world ever since then, dealing with the subject of creation versus evolution, not only scientifically, but also theologically, of course. And I want to show you about creation evangelism, because I follow in the footsteps of the Apostle Paul. If you take a good look, you'll notice that the Apostle Paul used this approach on occasion. So I think if Paul used it, it's probably a pretty good approach. How about you? Hello? You could be a little more boisterous with the amens, folks. I'm going to say this for Lee's benefit. Look, when you say amen when a preacher makes a good point, it's like saying sick him to a dog. You know, we need the encouragement. Hello? All right? Amen. So what I want you to do is, if you would open your Bibles, and let's take a look at Paul's letter to the evolutionists. You're not turning. Paul's letter to the evolutionists. You don't know where it is? Oh, well, you have to remember, there's 66 books in the Bible, but some of those books are actually called scrolls. 5 of them are scrolls in the Old Testament. And sometimes we call them letters, is that correct? But in some of the letters that we have, you will, for instance, have a sermon. We have sermons that Jesus preached. We have sermons that the apostles preached, contained inside some of these books or letters, correct? And sometimes there is a letter contained inside another letter. And Paul's letter to the evolutionists is contained inside Romans chapter 1. If you'll turn to Romans chapter 1, we're going to take a look at verse 16 and to the end of the chapter. And this is Paul's letter to the evolutionists. And I would like you to think about it this way. I just love the Apostle Paul. Because when the Apostle Paul started to take a swing, he never pulled back. If the Apostle Paul started to take a swing, he went all the way. As a matter of fact, I know in a crowd of this age group, well, many of you are over 30. And, how many of you remember a comic strip we used to read called Joe Palooka? Come on, I should see a lot more hands than that, folks. Come on. Where did he get his name, Joe Palooka? It comes from pugilist. Remember, Joe Palooka was a boxer. He was a prize fighter, correct? A good guy. But the word pugilist is the ancient word for prize fighter, boxer, and so forth. And Paul would actually use this. He would say, we do not, as boxers do, shadow box against the wall. You start to take a swing, you go all the way with it. Hello? It's one of the things I love about the guy. You know, right after Jesus, that's the one I want to meet next. But in his letter to the evolutionists, I'd like you to think about it this way. He's facing, shall we say, this direction. And he makes 2 very positive statements in verses 16 and 17. So in verse 16, he says this, for I am not ashamed of the gospel. Are you? See, that was my question, folks. I said, he says he's not ashamed of the gospel. Are you? No. Well, I'm glad to hear that. He says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, the Gentile. But that word means evolutionist. It means atheist. In God's economy, there's only 2 kinds of people. There are Jews and those who are not Jews. That's what the word Greek Gentile refers to. But remember that the Hellenistic world of Alexander the Great, the world of the Romans, the world of the Egyptians, the world of the entire, Mediterranean area of that time believed in evolution. They believed that people evolved. They believed that gods evolved. For example, 2,500 years ago, the Greek philosopher Anaximander said, fish walked out of the water and became people. But that is exactly what they're teaching in your public schools today. They haven't changed anything. They are using more modern terminology, but the ideas they're teaching are ancient ideas. Evolution has been around since the Garden of Eden, philosophically speaking. And so the early church was having to deal with the science of creation versus evolution. Here he says that the gospel is for salvation to those who believe, to the Jew first, also to the Greek. Do any of you remember 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 23? The teaching of Jesus Christ is a stumbling block to a Jew, but it is foolishness to a Greek, a Gentile, an evolutionist, an atheist. Why is that? Because remember, the believing Jew, the one who believes in the God of the Old Testament, the Father, Creator God, knows the right Father, Creator God. The problem for the Jew is recognizing that Jesus is the promised Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach, that he is the Christ, the Messiah. And so that's just a stumbling block for a Jew because they know the right Father, Creator God. The problem is getting them to accept the Son, Jesus. But to an evolutionist, to someone who does not believe in a God, well, it is foolishness. Why? My basic question to you this morning is this. How do you introduce someone to the Son of God if you don't think there's a Father God? Hello? How do you introduce somebody to the Father, Creator God, denying the Son? So to preach the Son to the evolutionists, well, that's foolishness because they don't believe there's a Father, Creator God, correct? Then let's take a look at the next verse. He says, for in it, the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as is written, but the righteous man or woman shall live by faith. Is that correct? Now, at that point, having made two very positive statements, Paul then turns 180 degrees, and starting at verse 18 to the end of the chapter, Paul uses some of the most graphic language contained in the entire Old Testament. That's one reason I just love the guy. He doesn't pull back. He simply puts it right straight out there. Hello? And starting at verse 18, you'll notice that from this very positive statement, he then says, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men and women who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Ladies and gentlemen, I spent 20 years of my life being taught by men and women who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Think with me. Now, I do want to say this for their benefit. Some of them did it just following along with the crowd. Some of them did it just parroting what they'd been taught. That's basically what I did. Some of them did it just to get a paycheck. But there were those men and women in my life who suppressed the truth in unrighteousness because they knew evolution was not true, but they taught it to me anyway, because they taught it in order to support their worldview, that there was no God and therefore everything was okay. You know, evolution is a religion of convenience. If it ain't convenient, it don't fit their religion. And for them, everything goes. Is that correct? And so they taught it to me, knowing it was wrong, but for their own purposes, their own religion. And evolution is a religion. I think you'll agree that to say that there are men and women who will suppress the truth in unrighteousness is a very bold statement, correct? How does Paul back up his bold statement? You will notice in the next verse, because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. Every human being on earth knows that God exists. Everyone. Even the greatest atheists in the world, like Richard Dawkins, for instance. Well, he does know that God exists. He's just not willing to admit it. And it is a bold statement to say that everybody in the world knows that God exists. But how do we know this? Think with me for a moment. God has created us with a mind that intrinsically knows the difference between randomness and design. Is that correct? We intrinsically know the difference. And when you see design, you know there's a designer. As a matter of fact, he's going to use this very argument a little later as he writes. But I don't care where you go. Now, I'm a missionary. I'm working on 5 continents. You can go to the farthest island in the Pacific. You can go to the deepest jungle in Africa, Brazil, whatever. It doesn't matter where you go. Everybody worships something because everybody knows there's something greater than themselves. I don't care whether it's a rock, a tree, money, title, position, clothing, car. It doesn't matter what it is. Another person. Everybody worships something because everybody knows there's something greater than themselves, and every human being knows there's a God. Hello? And again, that is a rather bold statement, but how does he back that up? You'll notice in verse 20, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without. I intentionally leave off the last word there. I'll show you why later. But notice, Paul here uses the argument by design. 400 years after Paul, St. Augustine of Hippo would write that this is one of the 5 classical arguments for the existence of God. And Paul says that Adam and Eve were there at the beginning, that creation since then has been seen. Jesus would say, Adam and Eve were there at the beginning, and so forth. And so since the creation, human beings have seen the invisible God, his eternal power, his divine nature, seen what has been made, the evidence that he left behind, the argument by design, that when you see design, you know there's a designer. And let me show you how it kind of works. Of course, I have been here over 2 decades. You do change the place occasionally while I'm gone, and you don't tell me. But it's okay, I can take it. But for example, I'm going to say, there's a thing over here, we call that a stool, because you call things like that by convention a stool, but I have never, ever touched it, felt it, smelt it, tasted it, weighed it. I've never tried to sit down on it whatsoever. We will acknowledge it does exist. We can see it, right? But never having done anything scientific. Again, never touched it, felt it, smelt it, weighed it, nothing except to realize it does exist over there. But I've never sat down in it. But what is the one thing I do know about it with absolute certainty? Yeah, well, somebody said you can sit on it, but that's actually not something I know, absolutely, because that could be a clever fake made out of balsa wood. And if I sat in it, it might collapse completely, correct? But some of you got the answer right. Whether it's a real stool or a fake stool, somebody made it. Because you know things that shaped like that don't come about by random chance, correct? Or we have some Bose sound columns over here. I don't even know if they're hooked up. I don't even know if there's any electricity going to them. I don't know whether we were using them in the surface or not. But again, whether I have tested them or not, what is the one thing I absolutely know about them? There was a speaker maker, is that correct? These chairs, again, many of them I've never sat in, some I have. But the ones I have not, I've never tested. They look like they hold me up, but again, it could be clever forgeries. But whether it's a real chair or a fake chair, somebody made it. You know there was a chair maker. You drive down Ashton here, never having been inside this building. And what are 3 things you absolutely know about it? Think with me. We live in Hollywood East. Is that correct? This could simply be a Hollywood set shell with no internal walls, no seats, no people. But when you drive down Ashton, what is the 3 things that you absolutely know? There was an architect, a building contractor, and building permit people. Come on, folks, this is Sarasota County. You know, you know there was building inspectors. But have you ever seen them? No, they are invisible to you, but you know they do exist, or they did exist because of the evidence they left behind, correct? So even though they may be invisible, even though I may never meet them in my lifetime, if they're Christians, maybe I'll meet them in heaven. But in this life, I may or may not. Is that correct? But it doesn't matter. I know they existed because of the evidence that they left behind. There is more complexity in one tree outside this building than there is in the entire city of Sarasota. As a matter of fact, I will boldly say in the entire county. There is more complexity in one tree. Now, when you see that kind of complexity, you know there has to be a tree maker. When you see people, you have to know there's a people maker. When you see a universe, you know there's a universe maker. Is that correct? And so the invisible God is made known to us through the things he has made. Now, I left off one word at the end of verse 20. I did this for good reason. Your typical English translation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I work in 20 languages around the world. I am not at all concerned in a word-for-word translation. What I am concerned about, after all, how many of you have heard you always lose something in the translation? No such thing as a perfect translation, right? I am not concerned in a translation that's word for word. As a matter of fact, I will not work with translators. I only work with interpreters. Hello? You see, I'm interested in interpretation by concept. I'm not worried about a word for word translation. Now, this word in the typical English translation is usually translated as excuse. Some English translations say reason, okay? But what is that word actually? If you look it up in the Greek, it is apologia. Now, what does this word actually mean? What's apologia? Now, does it mean this? That I go around the world on 5 continents and I say, forgive me. I'm so sorry. I'm a Christian. I couldn't help myself. Hello? Is that what that word really means? No. You see, people confuse the word in Greek with the concept of apology, meaning that I'm apologizing for something that I've done wrong. Is that correct? But this word is correctly translated as the word defense. Defense. But what it means is a defense which is so rational, so reasonable, so logical, so based in evidence, it becomes an overwhelming offense. Did you hear that? The word is best translated defense, but it's a defense which is so rational, reasonable, logical, so based on evidence, it becomes an overwhelming offense. And Paul says evolutionists ain't got one. In essence, Paul says they are defenseless. Hello? Because what they believe is irrational, unreasonable, illogical, and unscientific. I think, again, you'll agree that's a rather bold statement to make, but take a look at the next verse. Notice in verse 21, for even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks, but they became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Verse 22 is on my top 10 list of my favorite Old Testament verses. I love this verse. Verse 22, it's only the first part of a sentence, but it says, professing to be wise. Would you agree with me? Excuse me. Evolutionists will stand up in front of you in front of a classroom, on radio, TV, right in magazines, and they'll say, oh, you can trust us. We know what we're talking about. They profess great wisdom, right? We know it's right. Trust us, right? They profess great wisdom. But then Paul says, but they became fools. Is that correct? Now today the word fools is relatively mild. I think you would agree. The smartest person in this room could come to a stop sign, driving up to a stop sign, and then you come to a complete and total cessation of forward motion. This is the legal definition of stop. Hello? And once it's safe to proceed, you will go across the intersection and down the road. But suddenly you realize halfway down the road you made a mistake. You were actually supposed to turn right. And this is why they put steering wheels on cars, is to correct mistakes, correct? So you turn around, you come back, you go this way, and you correct your simple little foolish mistake, correct? So today that word is relatively mild. I think you've got to agree, right? But that is not what Paul wrote. Ladies and gentlemen, you can read this in a Greek Bible not knowing Greek. You will recognize the word. Paul did not write that they became fools. Now remember, please, Paul wrote this, I did not. But he says, evolutionists stand up in front of you, proclaim great wisdom. We know what we're talking about. You can trust us. And then the Apostle Paul said this, but they became mentally useless. Mentally useless. That's actually the term that Paul wrote. And why are they mentally useless? Well, they exchanged the glory of the incorruptible God for an image in the form of corruptible man, of birds and four-footed animals and crawling creatures. They are evolutionists. They are worshiping the creation and not the creator. Is that correct? In fact, Paul will then double his statement. This is typical reasoning in Hebrew. It's called Hebrew parallelism. He then goes in verse 24, therefore God gave them over in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, that their bodies might be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. They stop short. Hello? And Paul even emphasizes it twice. Then Paul will give us, starting in the next verse to the end of the chapter, the consequences of what happens when people exchange the truth for a lie. Think with me for a moment, just as an economic arrangement for a moment. If you exchange the truth to receive a lie, is that a good or a bad deal? It's a bad deal, right? But if I exchange a lie for a truth, is that a good deal or a bad deal? It's a good deal, right? What Paul has said is evolutionists made a bad deal. They exchanged the truth to receive a lie. And when I received the truth and gave up the lie for it, I became not only a Christian, but a creationist as well. But what are the consequences of people who do this? Starting in verse 26 to the end of the chapter, Paul lists the consequences of teaching evolution only in our public schools, public universities, our public venues, and so forth. We're not going to read the whole list. It'd take too long. But I'm going to mention 4 things that he does right, but I will list them in the order in which he wrote them. What is the first thing that happens when you teach evolution only in our public schools? Women become lesbians. What's the second? Men become homosexuals. Then as you start to read down through the list, you'll come with the word murderer. Now that's murder of all kinds. It is not simply abortion or euthanasia or homicide. It includes suicide as well. Suicide is murder of self. That's what the word means, murder of self. And so, school violence. Do any of you remember Columbine High School, Aurora, Colorado? Did you ever read what the 2 shooters wrote? The reason they did it, they said, was because they were taught evolution in the school. That there was a superior and an inferior, that they were superior and had the right to blow away the inferior. Hello? But they did that because they were taught evolution. And as you continue down the list, you'll come down towards the end of the list with, and disobedient to parents. Now, please tell me, ladies and gentlemen, as we have seen evolution being taught in our public schools, universities, colleges, and so forth, put across Hollywood movies, etc., what do you see more of in our society, in our culture today? Do you see more lesbians, more homosexuals, more murders of all kinds? And do you see more disobedience to parents and grandparents, I might add? It is a natural consequence of teaching evolution only in our schools. We are reaping what we have sown. But I want to draw your attention to the last verse. Would you take a look at Romans chapter 1, verse 32? You will notice that Paul then writes, "And although they knew the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but they also give hearty approval to those who practice them." Is that correct? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you have never seen a gay rights parade. I really do. But I'll bet you've seen some video clips, haven't you? Did you happen to notice in those video clips, you'll see people going down the street doing some of the most debauched things a human being can possibly do. Is that correct? But think about those clips. Did you notice in the clips, there are the people that are in the parade, but there are also people on the sidewalks on both sides of the street going, "Oh yes, this is so right. Oh, it's so wonderful. Oh yes, this, hello?" There are those who do them and those who applaud as the parade goes by. Paul is describing a gay rights parade in Rome 2,000 years ago. Hello? There are those who do those things and those who condone it and applaud it. Hello? Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the problem. Now let's take a look at the solution. Would you turn to the book of Acts? Interesting, chapter 17, starting at verse 16. What is the solution to the problem? Acts 17, starting at verse 16. You notice it says in verse 16 that Paul is waiting in Athens for his companions. And remember, the Holy Spirit had told him to go over to Greece. And while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him as he was beholding the city full of idols. Let us define what is Athens 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years ago, Athens was a major, major world capital. It was the crossroads of the Mediterranean world. Every caravan that went from Europe to Asia, Asia to Europe, went through Athens. Every ship from North Africa, Europe, going back and forth would go through the port of Athens. It was the crossroads of the ancient world, but it was also the Berkeley of 2,000 years ago, the Harvard of 2,000 years ago. It was the capital of evolution. Again, remember that they were evolutionists. They believed that people evolve, they believed that gods evolve. And so it's the crossroads of the ancient world and the capital of evolution at the time. And Paul has gone there by himself, waiting for his companions, but he's busy. He is not just sitting down there having a cup of coffee. Hello? He, first of all, is looking at the city full of idols. Now, it is absolutely true that Athens had statues all over the place. There were statues to people, statues to gods, statues to things. The city was full of statues. But when it says that Paul was looking at all the idols, we need to define the word idol. What does the word idol actually mean? The word idol actually means anything that stands between you and knowing God. Hello? An idol is anything that's between you and knowing the one true God. Again, it can be money, power, position, clothing, car, human being, whatever. But it's anything. And when it says that Paul is looking at Athens and he's looking at all the idols, he's not just looking at the statues. He's looking at everything that keeps the Greeks from knowing God. Hello? And then you'll notice it says next. So while he was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, he was also in the marketplace every day talking to those who happened to be present, correct? Now, maybe you think you've got a busy life. I think I do. I work 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. I think I got a busy life. And I'm sure many of you feel the same way. But compare your life to that of the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, on Friday night and Saturday, on Shabbat, he is in the synagogue reasoning with the Jews that Jesus is the promised Messiah, the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies. What is he doing on Saturday night and Sunday, the first day of the week? He is in the synagogues because they were for rent, and the Christian Jews and the Gentile Christians would rent the synagogue hall for a meeting on Sundays. And so he's on Sunday in the synagogue, and he is building up the Christian Jews, the Christian Gentiles in the faith. Is that correct? And the other 5 days of the week, what is he doing? He's doing what we call street evangelism. He's in the marketplace, and he's walking up to people, and he's saying, hey, friend, have you heard about this man that God raised from the dead, Jesus Christ? You haven't. Hooks an arm around his, says, come on down to McDonald's, I'm going to buy you a cup of coffee, and we'll talk about it. Okay, if you prefer Starbucks, whatever, but the fact of the matter is, coffee is it's a great evangelistic tool if you just use it right. Hello? I think he's kind of busy. How about you? But you will notice in verse 18, while he is in that marketplace doing these things, and also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. Some were saying, what would this idle babbler wish to say? Others, he seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities. But why did they say that? The Bible tells us why they said that. Because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection, correct? Now, I want you to think about this. Paul comes into Athens, the capital of evolution. And it says that the Stoic and Epicurean philosophers came to him, correct? They are the only two mentioned in the Bible here. But why? Why are they the only two? You may not realize it, but it's because they represent the two ends of the spectrum of Greek philosophies. You have to understand there were 1,000 different Greek philosophies between the two. The Epicureans and the Stoics simply represented the two ends of the whole spectrum with 1,000 in between. And so they are representing the entire spectrum of Greek philosophy. And what did the Epicureans believe? Now, the philosopher Epicurus had been dead for 300 years when Paul walked into town. These are the disciples of the Greek philosopher Epicurus. But what did he teach? He taught, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. He taught you only go around once, you got to grab it while you can. He who dies with the most toys still dies. He is the one who said, every sensual pleasure was good and should be taken advantage of as often as possible. That you should have intimate relations with man, woman, and animal. Every sensual pleasure was good. As a matter of fact, why is this word used particularly in food? Because the Epicureans would go in and eat a feast to the point that they couldn't hold another bite. Then they would go out in the alley, stick their finger down their throat to go back in so they could eat more. Every sensual pleasure was good and should be taken advantage of as often as possible. Well, that was the Epicureans. What about the other end of the spectrum with 1,000 philosophies in between? What about the Stoics? The Stoics taught no sensual pleasure was of any value whatsoever. They taught that you were not even supposed to enjoy the process of getting children. Hello? Okay, if you don't understand, when a baby was born in a Stoic family, they put a permanent tattooed frown on their face. That one's not true, folks. The Stoic would not laugh at the funniest joke they have ever heard in their life. I'm beginning to believe that half of you are Stoics. They need more caffeine, I'm telling you right now. So here they just represent the two ends of Greek philosophy. And what happens? Paul walks into Athens. He has the 44 magnum of Christianity, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. He points it right straight at the Greeks and he goes, boom! And some of the Greeks did exactly what some of you just did. They went, huh? What's that? But ladies and gentlemen, the Greeks were the greatest gossips the world has ever known. I have biblical authority for that statement. But the Greeks were the biggest gossips the world has ever known. Greeks would rather gossip than eat, etc., etc., etc. And what happens? If you have just the simple marketplace kind of gossip, did you see that dress Mrs. Green was wearing? You do that in the marketplace. But if you got that really big, juicy gossip, we got this official place up here on Mars Hill, and when you got the really good stuff, I mean that prime, we talk about it up there. And I said that the Greeks were the greatest gossips the world has ever known. I meant it. Think with me. The Greeks had seen everything. Is that correct? When you came into town, a Greek did not ask you, what did you bring? They didn't care whether you had gold, silver, spikes, silks. It made no difference to them whatsoever. They had seen it all. What was the first question a Greek asked when you came into town? What have you heard? Are Mark Antony and Cleopatra still fooling down there in Egypt together? Hello? What's the latest gossip from Rome? Is the emperor fooling around with several other wives? What's the latest gossip from Jerusalem? They didn't know, didn't care what you had. They just wanted to know, what have you heard? And so Paul comes into town with this message of Christ and the resurrection. They say, man, what's this guy talking about? This is big, juicy stuff. We need a formal place. So they take him up on Mars Hill. You notice verse 19. They took him and brought him up to the top of Mars Hill, saying, may we know what this new teaching is which you are proclaiming? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. We want to know, therefore, what these things mean. Now, please notice verse 21. If you have a properly printed Bible, verse 21 is a parenthetical statement. Please note that. There are very, very few parenthetical statements in the Bible. This happens to be one of the very few. But parenthetically it says this. Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. Biblical authority. The Greeks were the greatest gossips the world has ever known. But Paul knows the Greeks. He writes excellent Greek. He knows their culture. He knows their literature. He is going to quote a Greek poet in this chapter of the Bible. And he knows the Greeks. He knows how they think. Notice verse 22. And Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. Come on, folks, you got to get the smile. Men of Athens, I've noticed you're very religious in all respects. Sounds very complimentary, don't you think? Sounds really nice when you read it, doesn't it? What you don't realize is what Paul has actually just done is he's taken a 32-inch sword, stuck it between the ribs of the Greeks, turned it, and then pulled it back out again. Hello? He says they're very religious in all respects. Now, what is the root for the word religion? The root for it is bondage. Bondage. Now, for instance, when I became a Christian, after all, coming from the evolutionary community, people used to say, oh, I hear you got religion. I responded, no, I don't got religion. I've got relationship. It's very different. Hello? No, I don't got religion. I got relationship. And so, what did Paul just do? The word that he uses here, religion, or the root bondage, is correctly used when you say it this way. Oh, you know Uncle Ted. He goes fishing every Saturday morning religiously. Uncle Ed, he goes and he plays football every Saturday morning religiously. And please tell me, ladies and gentlemen, what happens if he can't go fishing on Saturday morning or he can't go play football for the next 6 days? Kicks the cat, kicks the dog, kicks the wife. He's not fit to live with. Is that correct? Until the next Saturday morning comes around. And he can go fishing and he can go play football. Hello? You see, what's the problem? They're in bondage to fishing, in bondage to football. Is that correct? And that's the way the word is correctly used. And so when it says here, men of Athens, I've noticed you're very religious in all respects. He has just stuck the sword in, turned it, and pulled it back around. He's saying you guys are in bondage to everything. And so what does he do? Well, up on Mars Hill, they had pedestals with statues of God, a sign that says to the unknown God. Remember that the entire objective of Eastern religion, no matter what it is how do I keep the gods off my back? What can I do to placate the gods? Because in Eastern religion, the gods are simply superhuman. They're exactly like us, they're just bigger. And they can be capricious, as we can be as well. And so if you don't do what they want, if you don't give them what they want, then they're going to hurt you. And so Paul, knowing this, he knows how they work. Now, the Greeks wanted an out. So what happened if they found out about a new god? They would immediately make a statue of the new god, get a nice brass plaque with his name on it, or hers, put it on the pedestal, and then move the sign over to the next pedestal. You see, this way they had an out. They would say, oh, don't hurt us. We just didn't know you existed, but boy, as soon as we found out you did exist, did you see that statue we made of you? That nice brass plaque there with the black lettering on it, hello? So don't hurt us. We just didn't know you existed. And Paul says, you see that sign, the unknown God? He's the one I'm here to talk with you about. And he doesn't need to be on a pedestal either. Human hands cannot create a statue of him either. Notice what he says. You know, while I was passing through, examining the objects, I saw the... Verse 24, he's talking here. What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples, made with hands. Neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all life and breath and all things. And he made from one every nation of mankind to dwell on all the face of the earth. We're going to talk about that tonight, so you're going to want to be back then. And the boundaries of their habitation, their appointed times, etc. Now, what is he doing? He's telling the Greeks there's a God that's invisible to you. You can't make a statue of him. You can't put him on a pedestal. And he's the Father, the creator God of the entire universe. And so he doesn't preach Christ first. Did you notice that? He doesn't try to introduce them to Jesus first. What he does is he establishes the existence of the Father, creator God first. He then tells about his acts. And you'll notice that when you finally get down to verse 30, therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance. Remember, he started with ignorance, and now he repeats it again. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the word ignorance is a great word. People tend to think of it as a dirty word, but it's not. The word ignorance simply means agnosis. It means without knowledge. Now, every one of us in the room are without knowledge. I've got 2 doctorates, but there's lots of things I don't know. And every one of you in this room, every single one of you knows things I don't know. Tons of things I don't know. We are all ignorant. But notice he did not call the Greeks stupid. Is that correct? They were quite intelligent. But they didn't know the truth. And Paul is there to give them the truth. Is that right? But he doesn't introduce them to Christ first. He introduces them to the Father, the Creator God, first. Then what does he say? Notice that having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to all men and all women that all everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men and all women by raising him from the dead. He establishes the truth of creation first before he introduces them to Christ, correct? This is called creation evangelism. And there are 3 results. Now again, this is not to replace sharing faith. It's just a tool you can use in sharing with others when faith is not enough. You know, that's not what will affect that particular person. But there are three things that happen as a result of creation evangelism. Look at verses 32 to 34. Verse 32. Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some began to sneer, but others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. So Paul went out of their midst, but some men and some women joined him and believed that very day. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 3 results of creation evangelism. 1/3 of the people will say, my mind's made up. Don't confuse me with facts. Remember that I used to be an evolutionist. Now, unless you're willing to learn, you will never be willing to change. Did you hear that? But I was willing to learn, and because I was willing to learn, I became a Christian, and then I became a creationist. But you've got to be willing to learn. But there's 1/3 that says, my mind's made up, don't confuse me with facts, I'm unwilling to learn, therefore I'm unwilling to change, correct? 1/3 said, you've got substance. You've got arguments. It's rational, reasonable, logical. It's based in evidence. You've got substance here, and we need to learn more about it. And they would come back. For instance, we're going to be here another 4 nights. They're going to come back, learn more about it, and some of them will change. Doesn't say all, but some will. But there was 1/3 who said, I got it. I got it. You don't need to go for it. I got it. And they believed that very day. Now, Brother Lee, he's going to come up and he's going to talk with you for a moment. So, brother, come on up. But I have a challenge question for all of you while he's coming. Which of those 3 groups are you in? Are you in the group that says, I'm unwilling to learn, I'm unwilling to change? Or you need to learn more to see for yourself? Or you're ready to believe this very day?